Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the second TEQSA Talks webinar. My name is Sam McAuliffe. I'm the Acting Assistant Director of Policy and Research here at TEQSA, and I'll be your MC for the afternoon. It's a very exciting time for us here at TEQSA, with our new CEO, Dr. Mary Russell, being confirmed, and with a new Acting Chief Commissioner, Adrienne Nieuwenhuis, both of whom we'll hear from in just a moment. We also have a fabulous panel here with us this afternoon to answer your questions and participate in a discussion, and I'll introduce them shortly. Before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to deliver an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, TEQSA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Our TEQSA office is located on the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people, a part of the Kulin Nation. And if you don't already know the traditional land where you are currently located, I do encourage you to find out. This webinar is running slightly differently to our first session back in April. We've been listening to your feedback and we have made a few changes to improve things. Some of those notable changes are we've moved from Teams to the Zoom platform. We've provided you with the opportunity to ask questions in advance, and we've tweaked the format of the TEQSA Talks just a little bit. Shortly, we'll hear from our Acting Chief Commissioner, Adrienne Nieuwenhuis. This will be followed by an update from our CEO, Dr. Mary Russell. This update has been pre-recorded as Mary is currently in Canberra. After the CEO update, we will move to a moderated question and answer session with a three-person panel comprising Acting Chief Commissioner Adrienne Nieuwenhuis, Acting Executive Director of Regulatory Operations Katrina Quinn, and Director of the Higher Education Integrity Unit, Dr. Helen Ganneal. Please be sure to submit your questions throughout today's webinar for the panellists to address. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A function. If for some reason the Q&A function doesn't work for you, please submit your question to the following email address, which is comms@teqsa.gov.au. And finally, if you are unable to stay for the entire session this afternoon, don't be concerned. A video recording of this webinar will be uploaded to TEQSA's website early next week. Okay, first up, I would like to introduce TEQSA's Acting Chief Commissioner, Adrienne Nieuwenhuis. Adrienne joined the TEQSA Commission in late 2021 and commenced as Acting Chief Commissioner following Peter Coldrake's resignation in May. Adrienne, thank you for joining us today. I have a few questions for you to get things started. So, question one, from your perspective as a TEQSA Commissioner, what are the key regulatory risks and issues you're concerned about in 2024?
Thanks, Sam. Well, I actually have a bit of a list. The top two on my list would be everything to do with international education and international education integrity. And the second on my list would be student wellbeing and safety, particularly having seen what's occurred with regard to the student protests on campus. But I'm not going to steal Mary's thunder because she's going to talk about those two regulatory issues in her update. So they're on my list, but Mary will talk about them a little bit more fulsomely in the next section. Other things that are on my list are governance and robustness of self-assurance processes. One of the reasons I say this is because the continuing problem we're having in the sector with regard to wage underpayment. You know, when two providers tell you that they've had a problem, that's sort of acceptable. When a few providers start to tell you they have problems, it becomes a little bit of an uncomfortable coincidence. But we are nearly up to nearly 30 providers who have informed us, and Fair Work, with regard to wage underpayment, which tells me there is something deeply going on in our providers with regards to governance, risk assurance, controls. How do they understand the deep issues that are going on in their providers and in their systems. So that's one of those ones where I'm starting to think we need to see root cause analysis, not just the fixing of a particular problem. I'd also say that, unsurprisingly, what's also on my list is academic integrity and artificial intelligence. Those continue to be on our radar, and of course Helen, who we'll be hearing from later, and her integrity unit are doing great work in that regard. Something that is emerging and has been emerging for a little while, but I think will become even more problematic given what I've just commented on with regard to international education, is the financial standing of providers. We are definitely seeing a weakening in financial position of many of our providers, and that has a range of potential risks in terms of compliance with the standards, the quality of education, and the worst case scenario would be provider default and all that means for students. Finally, we continue always to have a very close eye on everything to do with student experience, students' outcomes, and the quality assurance of the whole system.
Thank you very much. Another question for you.
Just breathe.
A priority reform that the government outlined during the budget is greater harmonisation between higher education and vocational education and training. Do you have any thoughts that you would like to share on this?
Well, just for the detailed, specific part of that in the budget was an amount of money to TEQSA and ASQA to work on, the regulatory harmonisation between vocational education and training and higher education. To some extent, this is not new to either regulators. We've been working for some time on how we harmonise our processes, particularly for our dual sector providers. But in the broader terms, it's also about the things we hear often around harmonisation. Parity of esteem between vet versus higher education, pathways between both systems, credit transfer, RPL, higher apprentices is emerging, between vet and higher ed, the positioning of the TAFE system and so on and so forth, other broader things that came out of the Accord with regard to harmonisation. And all of those have aspects in the standards. Credit transfer that is appropriate and has integrity, but also opens up the system for students. We've seen interesting times always around credit and RPL. Again, different funding models, different regimes can create compliance or regulatory issues with all of those things. So how do we work more closely with ASQA on all of those broader activities?
Thank you very much. Some exciting work ahead. Finally, another topic we're all thinking about regarding the implementation of the Universities Accord is the new Australian Tertiary Education Commission. Do you have anything to say regarding TEQSA's position on this?
Well, hopefully everyone in our audience has seen there's a consultation paper out there at the moment, and I encourage people to submit their ideas back to government. From TEQSA's perspective, we will support government in the way in which they will implement the ATEC. From our perspective in particular, I think it's good to see in the consultation paper a governance structure which separates TEQSA from the ATEC, so that the ATEC is intended to be a policy and a funding body, and leaving regulation and quality assurance quite appropriately separate in TEQSA. I'd also say that some of the things that are in that consultation paper around things like performance measures for the system will be beneficial to TEQSA as well. We already look at a range of data with regard to the performance of providers, which informs our risk frameworks and our regulatory processes. So we're looking forward to working with the ATEC on some of those broader issues as well.
Thank you very much. And finally, I believe you might have...
I have something to announce.
An announcement.
Yes. So I want to share some good news. The TEQSA Assessment Experts Forum and the guiding principles which arose from that event, outlined in the paper Assessment Reform for the Age of Artificial Intelligence, has received global recognition as one of the 3 winners of the 2024 Tracy Brightag Prize for Academic Integrity. The assessment reform guidelines principles were developed to support the sector in considering the risk and opportunities of generative artificial intelligence to teaching, learning and assessment. They were launched in 2023 at the TEQSA conference, and they have been downloaded more than 10,000 times from our website. So congratulations to the 17 experts that the team brought together who partnered with TEQSA under this initiative, which was led by Associate Professor Jason Lodge from the University of Queensland, Associate Professor Sarah Howard from the University of Wollongong, Professor Margaret Bierman and Professor Phil Dawson from Deakin University, and of course our own TEQSA team. So congratulations to everyone that was involved.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. Next up, we're going to hear our pre-recorded message from our CEO, Dr. Mary Russell.
Good afternoon and welcome to our second TEQSA Talks. This is my first as TEQSA's CEO, and I'm really pleased to be with you. So today I want to update you on some of the current issues within the sector, particularly around international education and campus protests and the work that TEQSA is doing in relation to those. So international students and visa integrity are really key issues of concern for the sector at the moment, and we are hearing a lot from providers about the impact that changes to visa processing and the potential impacts of amendments to the ESOS Act that are currently before Parliament. I want to share with you a little of the regulatory focus that we have on some of the underlying concerns relating to higher education. While the Nixon review brought into sharp focus issues of criminal conduct that exist in the vet sector, we can't be complacent in assuming that the higher education sector is not at risk from similar activity. TEQSA is concerned that some providers may not be appropriately or fully managing the risks associated with recruiting international students. Poor practices increase the risk that overseas students are not set up for success or, at worst, are exploited within our sector, as well as undermining Australia's reputation for quality education. This has significant potential to undermine trust within the sector, including in markets that are important to higher education providers. We're concerned about some specific practices that are relevant for higher education providers. In particular, that some providers are recruiting students who are not fully prepared for their courses of study or who do not genuinely intend to study in Australia. We're also concerned about signs that we're seeing that education agents are being used who do not always act ethically and in the best interests of students. And that prospective students are not adequately informed about circumstances in Australia, including information about accommodation and the cost of living. So these areas will be an ongoing focus for monitoring for us, and it's time, we think, for you to ensure that your own oversight arrangements are strong and compliant and appropriately monitored. So next, I want to talk about student protests on campus. Australian university campuses have been a focal point for debate and protest about ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Different points of view have been expressed widely in our community, and it's likely that these issues are also impacting on those studying and working in independent providers, as well as in universities. Protests and encampments in various forms have challenged universities to balance obligations to uphold freedom of speech and academic freedom with obligations to ensure the well-being and safety of students and staff. Our work with providers has shown us that generally the focus has been on working with students and staff in their communities to set and uphold expectations for debate and engagement that is respectful and is not harmful to others. There's been a really consistent emphasis on de-escalating conflict where possible to uphold safety and enable constructive dialogue. We've also seen, changing and ongoing sort of attention to taking steps to identify and investigate and respond to behaviour which is threatening, which vilifies or is discriminatory. And we've seen a variety of measures established to support vulnerable groups of students and staff. So TEQSA has been actively monitoring campus-based protests and engaging with providers to proactively ensure appropriate steps are being taken to uphold the higher education standards in these challenging and rapidly changing circumstances. On the 10th of May, TEQSA wrote to all higher education providers, setting out specific expectations of actions needed to uphold standards, with particular emphasis on ensuring student safety. We wrote again on the 5th of June and emphasised the necessity for ensuring that supports for vulnerable and impacted students need to be carefully considered and ensure that they're fit for purpose for these circumstances. In particular, they need to be trauma-informed and offer appropriately tailored adjustments and special consideration for students at assessment time. In addition to engaging with providers, we've also been speaking with student groups to understand their experiences and concerns so that these can be reflected in our responses. We're also assessing and responding to concerns raised with us directly about providers' management of specific instances and wider issues, and this may involve compliance assessment in some cases. So while protest activities and encampments have decreased on many campuses, our expectation is that ongoing leadership focus and resourcing will be needed. We understand, as you do, that the impact of both events in the Middle East and protest activity on campuses will have ongoing impacts over time. There's an ongoing risk of provocation, discrimination and vilification that will need to be monitored and very actively managed. Essentially, the end of formal protests won't necessarily mean that the risks have been managed. The strength and focus and persistence of providers' responses to these issues and their impacts on their communities will significantly impact reputation of trust, both for individual providers and for the sector as a whole. Some providers are focusing on what can be done now to strengthen social cohesion and respectful engagement in important debates, and this work will be critical in upholding the social licence universities have in Australia, as well as obligations and risk management with respect to higher education standards. So at TEQSA, we'll continue to focus on this issue in discussion with providers and with students. If you have things that you'd like to discuss in relation to these issues and responses within the sector, please reach out to us. We'd like to talk with you. The other thing I'd like to mention today is the work that we're going to be undertaking to develop our regulatory strategy. This is a piece of work that will guide the future of TEQSA's regulatory approach and align it with our corporate plan and objectives. It will support us to meet the expectations of government and our sector stakeholders, including both providers and students. We expect that this work will take 12 to 18 months, as it'll be informed by comprehensive engagement with the sector. And you'll hear more from us about this later in the year and in future TEQSA Talks. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining today before handing over to the panel, who'll be responding to questions that are received prior to and during today's webinar. Thank you.
Hello again. We are now going to move on to our panel Q&A. Before we go any further though, I'll just quickly remind everyone that in the Zoom platform, the chat function has been disabled, but the Q&A function is live, and that is where you can post your questions to be addressed by the panel. So please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. So we'll now move to our panel with Katrina Quinn, Adrienne Nieuwenhuis and Helen Ganneal, who are here and eager to answer questions from the audience. To begin with, we have a question for Helen to provide an update on the generative AI request for information regarding the next steps that TEQSA is taking.
Thanks, Sam. Good afternoon, everybody. So the RFI was due yesterday. So all providers of higher education were asked to submit their credible action plans through the provider portal by the 3rd of July. We have 205 registered higher education providers, and I'm delighted to say that 194 have submitted their plans on time, and a further 4 sought extensions that were granted. So that's a really fantastic response rate, and I think underscores the deep commitment to partnership that we're seeing from the sector on this issue, which is really fantastic. So we're really excited to be moving into the analysis phase of this project. We expect that it will take approximately 3 months to analyse the submissions, and hoping to launch then some good practice examples to support maturity across the sector around the time of the TEQSA conference in November. And of course, we'll also be following up with those 7 providers that we haven't heard from yet.
Thank you, Helen. Adrienne, we've got one for you about cost recovery. Will there be a consultation this year regarding TEQSA's cost recovery approach?
Thank you, Sam. See, I get all the fun questions, don't I? TEQSA's cost recovery model is designed in accordance with the Australian Government's cost recovery policy. Under that policy, we are obliged to continually review and work with our stakeholders and our providers on the appropriateness or otherwise of our cost recovery model. So yes, we will be doing a consultation with the sector later in the year, and we'll be letting you know in the coming months what will be going on.
Thank you very much. Katrina, we have a question that's been submitted in advance from Flinders University. And the question is, does TEQSA oppose enhancing contracts between an educational agent and a registered provider to incorporate more stringent oversight of sub-agents?
Well, thank you to whoever from Flinders University sent in that question. The short answer is no, we do not oppose any strengthening of any contract between providers and education agents. We understand that the sub-agents can be a complicated matter, so we would encourage and support you in your efforts to have greater oversight and transparency into those arrangements. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Adrienne, can you please update us on the progress of the service charter, stakeholder engagement strategy, and/or fit and proper person consultations that concluded recently?
Okay, I've got a list again, haven't I? Come on, bring the questions. All of those consultations concluded in May, and we're just looking through all the feedback that people provided. And once again, I thank everyone for their responses and for engaging with TEQSA. Our policies and our guidance notes are only as good as the feedback we get from providers so that we know we're hitting the mark. So as I said, we're looking through them now, and we'll be back to you as soon as we can in terms of the outcomes of those. Look out for them on our news, social media, our e-news and so on. But TEQSA's also very mindful that there's a lot of going on in the sector at the moment. There's a lot of policy papers out for consultation, ATEC, Managed Growth, and so on. So we're trying to manage our consultation and engagement not to overload the sector. But once again, thank you, and watch this space.
Thank you, Adrienne. So we've had another question come through, and I'll direct this one to Katrina. How do you perceive the impact of the new upcoming policy requiring new providers to obtain only 2-year registration for domestic students before becoming eligible to enrol international students?
Okay, so those policy decisions are a matter for government. However, from our perspective, the policy environment is rarely static. So as a general rule of thumb, we would expect providers to, the governing bodies, constantly monitor their risk frameworks and understand any potential impact that a policy decision might have on their operations, and it would vary across the sector, and prepare for the risk if there is going to be a risk to your particular provider, and to manage that appropriately. And I might also hand over to Adrienne as well, who might have some further insights.
No, I think you covered it off well, Katrina. Look, public policy is changing all the time. We would be expecting providers under their corporate governance and business models to be constantly looking at the environment, the changing environment, and managing their businesses accordingly. That said, we are very, very mindful of the potential impact of these changes in the ESOS bill, and we will be working with providers, and we've already started analysing our own data with regard to increased risks, the vulnerabilities of certain providers given their current business models, and of course for new providers coming into the sector, there's a real issue at the moment because often the business model is the other way around, where international student is then the beginning and domestic comes later. So we're very, very mindful of it and the impact, and we'll work with providers. But all of that said, we would also expect providers to be managing their own risks and their own business models.
Thank you both. The next question we have that's come through is, you mentioned student experience as a focus. Is there any update from TEQSA on the QUILT SES survey? Is there anyone in particular who would like to address that?
Unfortunately, no. We don't have the latest results as yet. I think I mentioned in one of my responses earlier in this session that those sorts of surveys are important to us in understanding provider performance, and we will look at those, but we aren't responsible for those surveys.
Thank you very much. So the next question is continuing a common theme that we're seeing in the sector, which is a concern around international students. And the question, which will be directed to Adrienne, is the reduction in the numbers of international students in the higher education sector after the past few years has had a great financial impact, leading to redundancies. Do you see this as being an ongoing concern?
Yes, as I said in response to the previous question, this is a concern because changes in the financial viability of a provider leads to a range of strategic decisions. Well, hopefully they're strategic. And so, and that then goes straight to the standards because it's around how the provider continues to be compliant with the standards. If they're doing cost cutting exercises, what is the impact on student experience, resources, all of those things, which then impacts on the compliance with the standards. So as I said in regard to the previous question, we would be expecting providers to be monitoring this very closely. In terms of the particulars of that question, which was around academic staff, again, TEQSA doesn't have a direct line of regulatory sight into industrial matters. That's not in our scope, but certainly what is in our scope with regard to the standards is Domain 6, which is all about corporate governance, Domain 3 and 4, which are all about teaching and learning and resources. And so whatever the decisions are, and in whatever way that a provider might be managing their budgets and managing their financial position, cannot then have an impact on compliance or with the standards.
Thank you very much. And I think this might be another question directed to you, Adrienne.
Well, I've read the accord and the consultation paper, so I'm as informed as the rest of you in terms of this matter. And as I said, it's part of government policy, and TEQSA will support government in the implementation of the ATEC. And as I said in my previous response, we are... Oh, okay, sorry, I hadn't read the question out. This is a question about what's TEQSA's role in terms of the ATEC. And as I said in my previous comments on this, the fact that different to the accord paper, the consultation paper has made it quite clear the separation between TEQSA and the ATEC. So the ATEC is very much about policy, it's about funding, as I said, it's about performance indicators. There's a very nice table in the consultation paper, and I encourage people to go and find it on the Department of Education's website, which leaves that nice separation with regard to regulation and quality assurance. I think it's very important that those who fund are not also the regulators. So it's great to see that there is a separation, but it's also great to see the way in which consultation with TEQSA will be part of the operations of the proposed ATEC.
Thank you very much. The next question that might direct over to Helen, if you would like to address it, which I'll read out loud now. How about school staff who attended protests and provided their support as collective educators? Are you going to offer any support channels for school management staff? And I would like to hear your consultation with educators in this process?
Thanks, Sam. I actually wonder if Katrina's better placed, but I mean, I think in general, Sorry?
I'll back you up.
Okay, I'll have a go. Look, in the discussions that both Katrina and Mary have been having with the leadership of the universities where the protests have been, the focus has been very much on supporting all staff and students with whatever the impacts are of both the conflict in the Middle East and also the protests and encampments on campus. Katrina, did you want to add anything to that?
No, it's the Higher Education Standards Framework requires the governing body to ensure a safe operational environment for including staff and students. And so when we've been making calls with the various universities who have had the encampments, we've been seeking to assure ourselves that the adequate and enhanced processes and activities are put in place to actually protect the safety and wellbeing of students and also the staff. And one example would be wanting to understand any interruptions in the learning environment, whether that be in a classroom environment or online, and the types of support that have been provided to the teaching staff who find themselves in situations that they would not otherwise be expecting. So we've canvassed a range of questions, across student, staff and the whole university community in general in terms of how the universities in this instance are actually managing any risks associated with the protests and encampment.
Thank you, Katrina. And you might be best placed to answer the next one as well, Katrina. Which is, when will the 2023 compliance report be released?
Yes, so that is, we acknowledge that it's a couple of months late, but I have my trusty comms people in the background that I can't go and ask right now, but that is actually hot off the press and should be released in the very near future. But thank you for that question.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Are you able to give us an update on compliance activities with relation to online program managers?
Okay, so this, I imagine, relates to the online OPMs, which deliver, they're often involved with recruitment and delivery of online education. Any type of third-party delivery under the Higher Education Standards Framework, we hold the actual provider responsible for the quality assurance and appropriate oversight of those activities. Any type of third-party delivery, whether it's transnational offshore or onshore through OPM online, inherent in that is an increased risk of non-compliance. So we would expect that the provider has appropriate mechanisms in place to monitor those cohorts and ensure the equivalency of experience regardless of where or how it's delivered.
Thank you very much. Adrienne, we'll move back to a question to you. So this is regarding our guidance and published guidance notes. So the question is, there were consultation versions of a governance monitoring and accountability guide and updated corporate governance guide on the website some time ago. What is the status of these consultations and when can we expect final products?
Thank you for that question. Yes, it's quite an important, given everything I've said, it's quite an important guidance note at the moment. So good on you, whoever picked this up and posed the question. So we've had a range of consultations. We've been working on updating it because our concerns from the Commission perspective, but also from TEQSA colleagues, that there were several aspects of that guidance note which were out of date and did need some thorough work, which we have done. And my understanding is that I think we're getting very close to it coming back to the Commission for final approval and publication. So keep an eye out and watch this space.
Thank you very much. Katrina, you might be best placed to answer this one, but feel free to move on if not. I am guessing. What steps does TEQSA take to confirm the veracity of data used to formulate each risk assessment with each provider in advance of issuing?
Okay, I'll have first go at this one, and I'm happy for my panel colleagues to jump in with additional information. However, the data that we use for our risk assessment are all we gather it from different sources, but they generally are, the data collection activity is administered by the department, the government. So that would be, there was a mention before about the Quilt survey data, but there's also the financial data that is provided to us by yourselves, the providers, and also we have the TEQSA system as well. So we use a range of data. We do not, it's not our data that we collect, but we use data that's already been confirmed. The veracity has been confirmed before it comes our way. Is there anything additional?
Yeah, look, that's correct, Katrina. We use the data sets that are either part of TAXI, part of Quilt. The financial data also comes through in terms of TAXI reporting, but we also look at annual reports and everything as providers are corporate entities. And as you know, whenever we put out our risk assessment reports, there's always an opportunity for the providers to come back to us and have a conversation with us if they're concerned that there's a piece of data that may misrepresent or doesn't quite show what's going on within that provider, and we can have a conversation and review. And I do know that there are some data elements, because they're just part of tax and everything else about student nutrition and retention, that often can need context, and we're always happy to hear about that context.
Thank you very much. So the next question that has come through relates to the support for students policy. And the question is, are there any further actions underway beyond the support for students policy related to the Higher Education Support Amendment last year?
Well, as you know, the guidelines are out. The department is running a little bit behind schedule with their own implementation. So providers had and I don't know the dates, I'm sorry, they're not in my head, but under the new guidelines, providers had a certain point in time that they had to publish on their website a link that took students to the student support policy and all of the related policies which sit underneath it. My understanding from the department that that's all going very well. The next question is the phase of reporting. So part of the new student support guidelines, there is a set of requirements for demonstrating how providers have complied with those guidelines. There is a working group at the moment in the department looking at, which is populated by a range of provider representatives, both public and private, around the finer details of those reporting guidelines. I would say from my own personal reading that the demonstration of compliance, the section in the guidelines where providers need to demonstrate compliance, are aligned to the sort of compliance that you would tell us about too, in terms of the standards with regard to student assessment, moderation, student support, students at risk, and so on and so forth. So I think providers are somewhat exercised by these guidelines, but I would say that they are very aligned to what you would already be doing under the standards, and that they're quite qualitative, not quantitative demonstration requirements. So again, I understand from being on part of that working group that providers are quite worried about the data elements of that. At the moment, the data elements are not large. My advice to you would be to tell the department exactly what you're doing and how well you're doing.
Thank you to everyone who has submitted a question so far. This is a friendly reminder that if anyone else is sitting out there who does have questions, please post them into the Q&A as we go. Next up, we do have a question that I'll direct towards Katrina. Can you provide us on an update on the recruitment process for the new Chief Commissioner and Commissioners that were recently advertised?
Okay, well, as best as I can, I'll provide an update saying that it is underway. The process is being run by the Department of Education, who is responsible for Commissioner recruitment. And the final decision is made by the Minister for Education. So we're obviously waiting on on the results of this process as much as you, and we expect the announcements will be made in due course.
Thank you very much. One now for Helen. Can you provide an update on the work that the HEIU is doing to address the risk of contract cheating?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, the work that we're doing around contract cheating is still a really important priority for the HEIU. We're continuing to progress that project the way we always have under our 3 pillars of enforcement, education and detection. The detection relates to the detection of the businesses themselves that are offering the commercial cheating services, and the sector's a really important partner for us in this. So please, when you come across a website advertising cheating services, or you come across a physical advertisement somewhere on your location or campus, please do register that with TEQSA so that we can add it to our database of suspected cheating websites. We share that database securely with our providers every 6 months so that providers are aware of the entire database. Under the enforcement pillar, we continue to block access to websites where we can demonstrate sufficient evidence that they are contravening the TEQSA Act. We recently blocked an additional 79 websites under our protocols with the major ISPs. So I think that brings to nearly 370 the number of websites that we've disrupted using those protocols. And then under education, I just want to take this opportunity to remind everyone on the webinar about TEQSA's online masterclass, Deterring and Detecting Contract Cheating. We've had really great uptake with that resource. We've had over 3,300 people register for the online masterclass, but we really need providers to continue to partner with us whenever you have new staff coming on board, particularly where they have some responsibility for either investigating or managing allegations of misconduct. Please direct them to that resource so that we can maintain the currency of that knowledge across our workforce in higher education.
Thank you, Helen. We've got another question that's come through for Katrina. Actually, it was submitted in advance, I believe. The Department of Education has issued proposed standards to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. How will this sit with TEQSA's requirements to prevent and respond to gender-based violence and sexual harm without duplication?
Yeah, that's a really great question that came through in advance, so thank you. I believe that was from Moreland College. So the National Higher Education Code to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, as well as the new Student Ombudsman, National Student Ombudsman that's currently being established, is setting out some really key compliance areas for the sector in relation to this very important issue. I can confirm that we've been working very actively and engaging deeply with the department, and also and we'll so with the do the same with the incoming ombudsman, student ombudsman, just to ensure that our roles and responsibilities are clearly delineated for the sector, and that we will work together to ensure that we address any issues that might arise around regulatory burden and duplication. So those conversations are ongoing.
And on a similar theme, how will TEQSA continue to monitor staff and student wellbeing and safety with respect to gender-based violence? At the last conference, providers were advised to implement the action plan. The National Higher Education Code is still pending. How much regulatory oversight will TEQSA continue to have on this particular issue?
Well, in the interim, I'll answer this in two ways. So in the interim, pending Student Ombudsman and National Code, TEQSA will continue to respond to any issues raised with us. We've actually created a sort of urgent response team. So whenever we get a complaint or an issue raised with us with regard to gender-based violence on campus, we have an immediate response team to look and assess and work through with the provider what's going on, assuring the quality, the confidentiality of everyone concerned. So we're doing that now, and we won't resolve from that. More broadly, and I think it goes to the previous question about overlap and regulatory overlap, the standards already have within it issues, requirements around student safety, student wellbeing. Other legislation now requires all corporate entities to have, sort of positive obligations with regard to safety and gender safety within their corporate organisations. All of those sorts of things exist and require providers to respond in the way that they should be responding should any of these instances happen. Until such time as we see the National Code, and as Katrina said, we are working quite closely with the department on the code. We are very mindful of regulatory red tape and how we will work together with the unit that's intended to be in the department, the Student Ombudsman and ourselves with regard to how we can get the best outcomes.
Thank you very much. Katrina, I believe this one might be directed to you. Are there, as yet, any reflections on the quality and usefulness of the relatively new self-assurance statement as part of renewals of registration?
Thank you, and I love this question. So thank you to whoever posted it. So we are finding the self-assurance statements that we have introduced. For those of you who are not aware, we have introduced the requirements as part of re-registration, and it is relatively new. However, the requirement for self-assurance is not. The requirement for self-assurance has always been a key feature as part of the Higher Education Standards Framework. So the self-assurance approach to our assessment, however, has really decreased the regulatory burden, for want of a better word, or the requirements on providers during the re-registration process. We are asking the providers to, in a short 6 to 10 pages, provide us a narrative of how they are managing risks and assuring themselves that the controls around their risk management are effective. It's a highly sensitive regulatory tool in the fact that the way that it is presented and the way that providers are describing how they are assuring their practices and compliance with the Higher Education Standards Framework is very, very telling and insightful in itself. So far, we have found it very highly effective, and I'll throw to Adrienne as well from a commissioner's point of view around decision making, etc., that there might be some further insights there for you. But it is going to be a key focus for us moving forward as part of our regulatory model, and we will be embedding that throughout other regulatory assessments moving forward in the future. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that from a commissioner perspective, when we have the reports of regulatory assessment in front of us, the self-assurance report is a really good read and it is very telling. And I suppose my advice to providers who might be developing their own self-assurance reports is to think about assertion, demonstration and evidence. So it's all very well to assert that you are doing something well, but it's better if you can actually demonstrate with evidence and examples how you are justifying what you're saying in your self-assurance reports. And I think that's the real telling between what we've read so far in terms of the quality of the self-assurance reports, the ones that you can clearly see that they have everything that they're talking about exists, because we do cross-check, by the way, and that the evidence is there and the articulation of the demonstration against a particular standard is really, really well evidenced, versus those where sort of the question and the sentence is, sort of responding to the question is exactly the same. So there's no evidence, there's no demonstration. So it's a bit like, when people write for a job interview or, something, you just can't assert. We need to see how you understand your practice and how you can evidence your practice in your self-assurance reports. But they are great, and thank you to those providers who have done them to date. They have been a very, very useful tool in our assessment. And I do hope, as Katrina said, that as we become more sophisticated about them, just as the providers become more sophisticated with them, that will reduce other parts of our regulatory process and make our regulatory decision making and our regulatory processes more efficient.
Thank you very much. Moving on to course approvals now. Can we provide an update on the planned changes regarding new course approvals?
I'm not aware of planned changes regarding new course approvals, so I'd encourage whoever wrote that question to perhaps flesh it out a little bit. We are going to like I'm assuming that's new course approvals for courses that are going up with initial provider application. And at the moment, the requirements in the Higher Education Standards Framework remain unchanged. So if there is a follow-up question to that, please pop it in not in the chat, in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer.
Thank you, Katrina. I might direct this next one to Helen. How do we register cheating services with TEQSA?
Thank you. I think Justine might pop in the... Oh, you can't pop it in the chat. Okay. So concerns@teqsa.gov.au. You can also email integrityunit@teqsa.gov.au. Either way, we will add them to our database.
Thank you very much. And I believe that brings us to the end of our Q&A session. But before we wrap up, Helen, I believe you wanted to briefly outline some pending new resources for non-university providers. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thanks, Sam. So, look, as you probably all know, Australia's higher education sector is an attractive target for cybercrime. We have providers with extensive IT networks holding a lot of sensitive data, both for staff and students, and often there are third-party arrangements and links to industry. So there's a lot there for cyber criminals to be attracted by. We've been really keen for some time now to support the non-university providers by developing some resources to help you increase your staff's awareness and mitigate the risk of cybercrime. So we've collaborated with experts across government and also with RMIT University's Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation to develop 2 e-learning modules which will be launched in early August. So one will be enhancing cybersecurity awareness, and the target audience for that is really all staff. And there will also be cybersecurity for senior leadership. So we recognise that for a lot of institutes of higher education, especially the smaller ones, these are responsibilities for cybersecurity are often outsourced. And so we've created within that some material about due diligence of third-party arrangements and the kind of questions you should be asking people who are bidding for these tenders at your institution. So these resources have been adapted primarily from resources that the Department of Education created for universities as part of the University Foreign Interference Task Force, but we've worked with experts to really understand what additional resources would be useful for non-university providers. So please stay watching the TEQSA news, and when those are launched, we really encourage you to get your staff to take those modules on TEQSA's LMS, which is the same place that the Masterclass for Deterring Cheating is located.
Thank you, Helen. I'm sure people will be keeping an eye out for those. I have been informed that we've had 2 more questions come through, so we're going to have 2 more, and then we will wrap up the session. So the second last question, which is very live. Thank you for the response regarding self-assurance statements. Is there any prospect of a similar approach being applied for CRICOS approvals?
Yes, we are looking to roll out self-assurance statements across all regulatory assessments, the cyclical assessments at least, and that would include CRICOS as well. But watch this space. We'll come out and talk about this more over the coming months and provide more clarity to the sector.
Thank you, Katrina. And this is following on from the course approval question. And the question is, will we be limiting new course applications after the 1st of January 2025? Will it apply to existing providers or new providers only?
No, I don't believe we will be limiting course applications after the 1st of January 2025.
I have no idea.
No.
The source of that. I've not heard anything about why we would be limiting course applications. So no, we're not limiting course applications. I'm wondering whether there's a confusion between our regulatory requirements and those of ASQA or something, but no, there's no limitations for TEQSA.
But thank you for following up on the question.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it for today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you very much to Katrina, Adrienne and Helen for being a part of today's panel. There will be a post-webinar survey emailed to everyone in attendance. Please be sure to respond, as your feedback does help us refine these sessions moving forward. And a recording of this webinar will be made available sometime next week, I believe, and we hope to see you at the next TEQSA Talks in October. Thank you very much.